"Sir, you can't be here!" The flight attendant's voice ripped through the cabin like a whip, sharp and slicing, cutting the air with an authority she believed was hers to wield. Heads jerked toward the sound as if pulled by a single invisible string. Passengers froze mid-step, mid-conversation, mid-thought. The rhythm of boarding collapsed into a stunned stillness. An arm shot across the narrow aisle, halting the tall black man who had just stepped into first class. The gesture was abrupt, almost jarring. Her body angled in a way that made the narrow space feel even smaller. Luggage straps hung limp from travelers' hands. Whispers began to move through the air, low, electric, dangerous, like the first rumble of a storm. Phone screens tilted discreetly, some already recording, catching the image before they even knew how explosive it would become. He stood still. Not defensive, not hurried, calm in a way that didn't belong to this moment. His boarding pass rested loosely in one hand, as though there was not a shred of doubt in his mind about where he belonged. But the way her voice had been pitched, sharp at the edges, dismissive in its center, was designed to cut, to humiliate, to reduce him to a question mark in a space that should have offered nothing but certainty. And somewhere in that moment, as eyes drilled into him from every side, an invisible clock began to tick. 15 minutes. That was all it would take before this woman, and every single member of her crew, would no longer have jobs to return to. Before we go deeper, what country are you watching from? Drop it on the comment. Hit that subscribe button right now and turn on the notification bell, because what you're about to hear isn't just another story about power and justice. It's a reckoning. It's the kind of truth that won't be found in polished press statements but burns itself into the memory of anyone who sees it unfold. And the crew? They had no idea who they had chosen to challenge. His name was Michael Lawson, 52 years old, Black American, a man who carried a history of entering rooms where he was underestimated and leaving them with his presence carved into the walls. Tall, broad-shouldered, his skin held the deep, rich tone of polished mahogany. His eyes were a quiet storm, calm to the casual glance, but with a depth that warned of the power beneath. He didn't need to raise his voice to command a room. He didn't need to demand respect. His silence alone spoke volumes. Michael's journey had not begun in the comfort of leather seats or glass-walled offices. It began in a cramped two-bedroom apartment above a corner store in Birmingham, Alabama. The walls absorbed the constant smell of frying oil from the shop below. Winters pushed icy drafts through cracked window frames. Summers trapped the air until it felt heavy in the lungs. His mother worked mornings at the laundromat, evenings cleaning office buildings whose owners never learned her name. His father, injured in a factory accident that ended his working years, spent long hours teaching Michael to play chess at the kitchen table, showing him that a single well-placed move could topple the mightiest king. Michael was 8 when the first memory of being marked as less rooted itself in him. A store clerk shadowed him and his mother from aisle to aisle, suspicion written plainly in his gaze. At 12, a teacher, kind-faced, almost apologetic, told him not to set his ambitions too high. At 16, he stood in line with his mother at a diner, the scent of bacon and coffee filling the air, only to be told their food would be takeout only, while white families settled into booths. His mother's grip tightened on his hand. She accepted the paper bag without a word. At home, she told him, sometimes you fight by walking away. Sometimes you fight by staying in the room until they realize you own it. Those words never left him. They became the spine of the man he grew to be. By his early 30s, Michael Lawson had founded Lawson Global Enterprises. It began in a single rented office, fueled by stubborn will and sleepless nights. By 52, it had grown into a multinational empire worth billions, employing tens of thousands around the world. He had walked into boardrooms where his skin was the first thing people noticed and walked out owning deals they swore would never be his. On this sharp-edged winter morning, Michael wasn't flying for business. He was returning home for the funeral of a childhood friend. His assistant booked first class as always, but Michael never announced himself in gold or noise. No watches designed to flash in the light, no entourage to part crowds, just a tailored charcoal overcoat, a polished leather briefcase, and the unshakable confidence of a man who knew exactly who he was. That quietness, however, was about to give his humiliation an audience. The first-class cabin was nearly full when Michael stepped through the doorway. He walked with the steady pace of someone unhurried, scanning the rows for his seat. But before he reached it, the lead flight attendant, tall, mid-40s, her blonde hair pulled tight enough to pull at the edges of her face, planted herself in the aisle. Her body radiated the wrong kind of authority. Her eyes scanned his coat, shoes, briefcase, and finally stopped on his face, lingering there with a verdict already made. Her tone was sharp, clipped and cold. She didn't even glance at his ticket. Instead, she flicked her fingers at two other crew members. They approached and positioned themselves to either side of him, closing the space like walls sliding inward. Conversations died out. The cabin air seemed to still. A man in row 2 leaned back with a smirk, watching as if the scene was entertainment. A woman in row 3 angled her phone, pretending to scroll while framing him, perfectly in her camera lens. Michael handed over his boarding pass. The lead attendant pinched it between her fingers, holding it longer than necessary before finally glancing down. The change in her face was brief but visible. Yes, his name was there. Yes, his seat was valid. Yet rather than offer the simple courtesy of stepping aside, she spoke in that overly sweet, performative tone that masks something sharper beneath, suggesting that perhaps he would be more comfortable in economy. It was an insult tailored to be deniable, wrapped in the fabric of false politeness. Michael didn't react. His expression was as still as stone. He stepped past her, took his seat, and placed his briefcase by his feet. But inside, the heat was there, the familiar heat of being reminded, in ways large and small, that some would never see you as belonging. The engines began to hum louder as the plane taxied down the runway. Outside, streaks of light blurred past. Inside, Michael's mind replayed that diner in Birmingham, the smell of frying bacon, the squeeze of his mother's hand, the weight of walking out with dignity intact. This time, though, he wasn't going to walk away. He was going to stay right where he was, long enough for them to understand exactly who was in their cabin. At cruising altitude, Michael opened his tablet, not for news or distraction, but to refresh an email thread that had been alive through the night. Lawson Global Enterprises was finalizing the acquisition of a struggling regional airline. Months of negotiations, weeks of legal detail, and last night, the final contracts had been signed. The ink was barely dry. At 9:03 a.m., Michael Lawson had officially become the majority owner of SkyConnect Airlines, the very airline he was flying on. The very crew who had tried to treat him like an outsider now reported to him, a vibration in his hand, a new message. From his assistant, "Congratulations, Mr. Lawson. All SkyConnect staff have been notified of the change in ownership," almost as if the universe wanted to underscore the moment. A chime sounded in the cabin. The captain's voice filled the air, smooth but tinged with a new awareness. He welcomed passengers, gave the standard flight details, and then, in a tone that was both formal and careful, congratulated our new executive chairman, Mr. Michael Lawson, who happens to be flying with us today. It was as if the cabin had been reset. Heads turned, necks craned. Smirks disappeared. Phones lowered. The woman in row 3 stopped her recording mid-frame. The lead attendant stood frozen, the blood draining from her face. The two other crew members busied themselves with coffee pots and folded napkins, their eyes darting anywhere but toward him. Michael didn't shift in his seat. He didn't have to. The silence that followed was a weight pressing, down on every inch of the cabin. 15 minutes after she had blocked him, Michael opened a blank email. 3 sentences, direct, final, addressed to the head of operations, with HR and legal copied. The subject line was clear. Immediate termination. Flight 227, crew. By the time the plane's wheels kissed the runway, HR representatives were waiting at the gate. Passengers gathered their belongings in silence, murmurs rippling quietly. The crew exited last, each intercepted before stepping into the terminal. Words were brief. Faces were pale. The reality of what had just happened was sinking in. Michael stepped into the terminal without looking back. Not from arrogance, not from spite, but because the matter was finished. Justice didn't always roar. Sometimes it was a scalpel instead of a hammer, precise, deliberate, leaving no space for confusion. The winter light poured through the high windows as he walked, stretching shadows across the polished floor. His mother's words returned to him again. Sometimes you walk away, sometimes you stay in the room, and sometimes you own it so completely that there's no question left in anyone's mind. For Michael, this wasn't about revenge. It was about dignity, about showing without a single word that respect isn't a gift to be granted. It's a right that doesn't depend on skin color. Those passengers would carry this story. Some would tell it with reverence, some with disbelief. Some would change the details, but the heart of it would remain. Prejudice picked the wrong man that day. And the wrong man was exactly the right one to end it. And that is how a man denied his first-class seat, dismantled an entire crew before the wheels even touched the runway. If this story hit you the way it hit me, subscribe right now, turn on the bell, and share it with someone who still believes respect is earned by skin color. Here, we tell the stories they'd rather silence. And the next one? You don't want to miss it.